Clara Vane, Duchess of Ashcombe, did not cry when her husband told their 9-year-old son to take another woman in to dinner. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at the woman in blue silk who had just been given, without a word of warning to anyone at the table, the chair that had been Clara's for 11 years. She unclasped the small iron key that hung at her waist on a plain chain, the key to the muniment room, the key that had not left her body in a decade. And instead of setting it down where a lesser woman might have thrown a glass, she pressed it into her son's hand. Thomas Vane, dressed for company in a coat still too new to sit easily on him, closed his fingers around the key, looked once at his father, and offered his arm to his mother. By the time the soup was cleared, half the county would know what the Duke of Ashcombe had asked of his heir. By the following autumn, the Duke would know precisely what it had cost him. The spring of that year had come to Renfield the way it always did, green and unhurried, indifferent to the fact that it was the year everything in the house would be counted twice. Clara had married Julian Vane, the 6th Duke of Ashcombe, 11 years before, in a match arranged by 2 fathers who had wanted, respectively, land and money, and had got, respectively, both. It had not been a love match. It had not been a cruelty either, not at first. Julian had been courteous in the distant way of a man managing an account he intended to keep solvent, and Clara, 17 and clear-eyed even then, had decided that courtesy could be built upon. The way a house is built upon a foundation nobody sees once the walls go up. For 11 years she had been the foundation. She kept the household books in a hand so neat that the vicar once asked to borrow her ledgers as a model for the parish accounts. She settled disputes between the dairy and the kitchen before they reached her husband's ears. She knew which tenant's roof would fail before the tenant did, because she read the rain against the state of the thatch the way other women read novels. None of this was visible, because it worked. A house that does not creak gives no one cause to ask who has been oiling the hinges. Julian, for his part, had grown colder with each year rather than warmer, and Clara had watched it happen without ever being told why. He managed the horses, the tenantry's larger disputes, and the county's politics, and he did all of it with the flat competence of a man discharging a duty rather than living a life. He did not raise his voice to her. He did not need to. He simply receded, year by year, the way a tide recedes from a shore that has stopped expecting the water back. 2 years before the night of the dinner, Julian's cousin, Mr. Edmund Price, had come to Ashcombe Court to manage the estate's business after the old steward retired to his cottage and his gout. Price was a smooth man, softly spoken, warm in exactly the rooms where warmth was profitable. He called Clara cousin with a smile that never went as far as his eyes, and within a season he had made himself indispensable to Julian in ways Clara could not name, but could feel, the way one feels a draught before finding the window that causes it. It was Price who had first mentioned, lightly, over a glass of port that Clara was not meant to overhear, that her late father's small estate of Ashfield had left certain accounts unsettled with Ashcombe before her marriage. A debt, he said, of some size, quietly carried out of respect for the family. It was Price who had suggested, months later, that a companion might ease the Duchess's burdens, given how thin she had stretched herself. A widow of good sense, a Mrs. Sylvie Marsh, could take on the correspondence and the lesser calls, freeing Clara for more essential things. Julian had agreed to it the way he agreed to most things Price proposed now, without inquiry, the way a man signs a paper he has decided in advance not to read. Clara had watched Mrs. Marsh's chair move, inch by inch over 8 months, from the foot of the table to a place nearer the Duke's right hand. She had watched her husband's silences lengthen and his glances shorten. She had said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say that would not sound, to her own ear, like jealousy, and Clara had promised herself at 17 that she would never be a woman who mistook her own dignity for a small thing worth trading for a scene. The harvest home dinner that autumn was meant to be an ordinary triumph, the tenantry fed, the neighbouring gentry invited, the good harvest toasted before the county's collective memory of a hard spring could sour it. Clara had planned the menu herself, down to the exact weight of the joints, because she always did. She had not planned for her husband to stand at the head of the table before the covers came off and announce, in the voice he used for estate business, that his son would take Mrs. Marsh in to dinner. The room did not gasp. That was the worst of it. It went silent the particular way a room goes silent when everyone present understands exactly what has been said, and is waiting, with a kind of ugly fascination, to see who will be the first to look away. Mrs. Marsh herself went the colour of the tablecloth. Thomas, standing very straight in his new coat, looked at his father as though checking that he had heard correctly, and Julian, not meeting anyone's eyes, said it again, flatter the second time, the way men repeat things they have already begun to regret. "Take Mrs. Marsh in, Thomas. Your mother will manage." Clara did not manage a single thing in that moment except her own hands. She unclasped the muniment key from her waist, the key to the room where every deed, every rent roll, every letter her father had ever written her was kept, the room that was hers by function if not by name, and she held it out, not to Mrs. Marsh, not to her husband, but to her son. Thomas took it as though it weighed more than it did. Then he crossed the small distance between his mother's chair and his own place, and offered his arm, and said, in the clear, unbroken voice of a boy who had not yet learned that courage sometimes costs a great deal to the person who shows it, "I should like to take my mother if it is all the same to everyone." It was not all the same to everyone. It was not all the same to Julian, whose jaw did something Clara had seen only twice before in 11 years of marriage, once when his own father's name was mentioned at a dinner much like this one, and once briefly on their wedding day. But no one at that table said a further word, and the soup, when it came in the ordinary way, and the county went home that night, with a story that would reach every parlour within 30 miles before the frost. Clara allowed herself 7 minutes. She had learned, over the years, to count her grief the way she counted anything else that might otherwise run to waste, in a fixed and generous but not unlimited sum, spent privately. In a drawer of the mind she opened only when the door of her own sitting-room was shut. 7 minutes, she decided, standing at her window while the last of the carriages rattled down the drive. She watched the clock on the mantel, and she let herself feel the full shape of the insult, precisely, without softening it. And then she closed the drawer. What was actually hers, she made herself list, the way her father had taught her to list anything that mattered. Ashfield, her father's small estate, settled on her at her marriage, and never touched since. £400 of her own, from the sale of timber her father had left her outright. A mind that had run this house, unthanked, for 11 years, and could run a great deal more than a house if it came to that. A son who had just, at 9 years old, done the bravest thing anyone in that room would do all evening. "I have work to do," she said aloud, to no one, and found that saying it steadied her more than the 7 minutes had. The first person she told anything to was Mrs. Hetty Bragg, the housekeeper, who had run the linen and the larders at Ashcombe Court since before Clara arrived as a bride, and who spoke, as a rule, in verdicts rather than sentences. Clara found her in the still room, decanting the last of the blackberry cordial, and said only, "You heard." "Whole house heard," said Mrs. Bragg. "Half the county'll hear by Tuesday." She set down the jug. "You want my opinion, or you want my help?" "Can't always give both at once, in my experience." "Your help," Clara said. "Then you'll not spend tonight weeping into the good linen. You'll spend it deciding what you mean to do about that man Price, because I've kept this house's accounts on the side long enough to know his numbers don't sit right, and I've said nothing because it weren't mine to say." "Mrs." Bragg wiped her hands on her apron. "Happen it's yours to say now." It was. Clara sat that night, not with a handkerchief, but with a candle and a fresh sheet of paper, and she began, in the small clear hand the vicar had once admired, a list of every discrepancy she had ever half noticed and dismissed as none of her business. It was the first entry in a private ledger that would, within the year, undo a great many things her husband believed to be settled. The granary at Low Marsh Farm had been leaking for the better part of a fortnight before anyone thought to tell the Duke, and by the time word reached Julian, he was 3 days from home, on business that mattered more to him, apparently, than 40 sacks of the estate's own barley slowly rotting under a roof no one had mended since spring. It was Tom Feathers, who tenanted the farm, and had raised the alarm to 3 separate people without result, who finally brought his complaint to the kitchen door of Ashcombe Court, because he had heard, the way tenants hear everything eventually, that the Duchess was the one who now saw to such matters. Clara went out to Low Marsh Farm herself, in boots rather than slippers, and stood in the granary with Tom Feathers while rain came through a gap in the slates the width of 2 fingers. She did not send for Mr. Price, who was, by his own account, occupied with the quarters accounts in his office, and could not be spared for a roof. She sent instead for the thatcher in the village, whom she paid from the household's own contingency fund without waiting for anyone's leave, and she had the granary's remaining barley moved, sack by sack, to the dry loft above the dairy, while the thatcher's boy climbed the roof. "Beg pardon, Your Grace," Tom Feathers said, watching her direct the moving of sacks with the flat competence of a woman who had clearly done sums like this before. "But is it usual, a duchess seeing to a granary?" "It is usual for someone to see to it," Clara said. "I find I would rather it were done than argued over whose place it was to do it." By the end of that week the granary was dry, the barley was saved, and the thatcher had been paid promptly and in full, a novelty on the Ashcombe estate that Tom Feathers mentioned, with some wonder, to at least 6 other tenants before Sunday. Mr. Price, informed after the fact, smiled his warm smile and told Clara she had shown admirable initiative, and Clara noted in her private ledger that evening that the thatcher's bill was 11 shillings less than the sum Price's own account book listed as having already been spent, that same quarter, on repairs to Low Marsh Farm, that had never, as far as anyone could discover, actually been made. It was a small thing. She wrote it down anyway. Write it down, her father used to say. Memory is a coward. But paper is not, and she had repeated the sentence to herself so often as a girl that it had stopped sounding like his voice and started sounding like her own conscience. Julian returned from his business 3 days later to find the granary roof mended, the tenant speaking of his wife with a warmth he had not heard directed at anyone in that house in some time, and his son full of an account of the whole affair that he delivered at breakfast with the breathless thoroughness of a boy who believes his mother has performed a miracle. Julian listened. He did not say much. But that evening, from the window of his study, he watched Clara cross the stable yard in the last of the light, deep in conversation with the Thatcher's boy about the drainage above the dairy, gesturing at the roofline with the precision of an engineer. And something in his face, Mrs. Bragg, who happened to be dusting the hall below and glanced up at exactly the wrong, or right, moment, described afterward as the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes. He said nothing to Clara that night. He said nothing the next morning either. But he began, without remarking on it, to take his coffee in the small parlour where she kept her morning accounts, rather than in his study, and Mrs. Bragg counted this, privately, as the first rung of a ladder that would take a very long time to climb. Mr. Price noticed it too. "Your wife is becoming quite the estate manager," he said to Julian one evening, in the tone of a man offering an amusing observation rather than a warning. "One almost wonders whether she means to put me out of employment." He laughed, and Julian, distracted, laughed with him, and neither of them noticed that Price's eyes had not laughed at all. The dispute over the mill leat at Ashcomb's northern boundary had been simmering for 11 years, longer than Clara's marriage, a slow argument between the estate and its neighbour Sir Walter Denny, over whose ancestor had diverted whose water first. Julian had inherited the quarrel along with the dukedom, and had managed it, as he managed most inherited things, by ignoring it until it grew loud enough to require a solicitor. That autumn it grew loud again, when Sir Walter's own mill ran dry for the better part of a week, and his tenants, not unreasonably, began to talk of taking the matter to law. Clara went to the muniment room, her muniment room, though the key had spent a fortnight in her son's keeping since the dinner, worn now on a ribbon under his collar like a medal he refused to relinquish, and asked Thomas, gravely, for its return, which he granted with equal gravity, as though transferring a seal of office. Inside, among deeds that had not been read by anyone in a generation, she found the original survey commissioned by Julian's own great-grandfather, showing the Leet's course as it had run before either family's grandfather had touched it, and a letter, brittle and half illegible, in which that same great-grandfather admitted, apologetically, to having diverted the water himself for his own mill, and promised recompense he had evidently never paid. She took the survey and the letter to Sir Walter Denny herself, without an appointment and without her husband, and laid them on his desk, with the flat courtesy of a woman presenting facts rather than an argument. "I believe this settles the matter rather more cheaply than a court would," she said. "The water is legally yours. I should like to discuss what recompense my husband's family owes you, since it appears we have owed it for some time." Sir Walter, who had expected a fight and been given instead a document and an apology, 2 generations overdue, was disarmed in the particular way of men who discover that the person across the table has already conceded the point they meant to argue. The matter was settled within the fortnight, at a cost to the Ashcombe estate that Julian, informed of it afterward, found considerably smaller than the legal fees he had been dreading for a decade. "You might have told me," he said to Clara. "Not quite an accusation." "I did tell you," Clara said. "In March, and in June. You were occupied both times." He had the grace to look, briefly, as though the arithmetic he disliked had just added another column. It was in the wake of this that Thomas, walking with his father along the mill leat one evening, asked him plainly why he had never noticed his mother's cleverness before, and Julian, caught without Price nearby to smooth the silence, told his son haltingly, in pieces, the way a man tells a thing he has never said aloud, about his own father, who had left this house and this family for a mistress in London when Julian was 8 years old, and about his mother, who had wasted through the following 3 years on a slow decline that everyone called a lingering illness and no one called grief, because grief was not a word anyone in that house had been permitted to use. I decided, Julian said, that I would never let feeling run a household. Feeling ran my father's, and it ran it into the ground. He did not say sorry. He did not yet know. Clara thought when Thomas relayed the conversation to her that night, with the solemn accuracy of a boy repeating a catechism, that there was a difference between explaining a wound and asking to be forgiven for the damage it had done while unhealed. But it was, she noted in her ledger, the first true thing he had told anyone in that house in 2 years, and she wrote it down beside the granary and the 11 shillings, because her father had also told her that a person's worth was measured less by what they felt than by what they were finally willing to say plainly. The county, meanwhile, had begun to speak of the Duchess of Ashcombe in a new register altogether. The vicar's wife mentioned the granary at every tea-table she visited. Sir Walter Denny called Clara, within his own hearing, the most sensible woman in 3 counties, which was, from a man who had spent 11 years contesting the family's water rights, very nearly a proposal of marriage in itself. Even Mrs. Marsh, whose position in the household had grown steadily more uncomfortable as the story of the dinner refused to fade, found herself the object of a curiosity that had nothing to do with her blue silk, and everything to do with wondering how long she meant to stay in a house whose true mistress the county had, so visibly, so audibly, begun to reclaim. It was Mrs. Marsh, in fact, who came to Clara's sitting-room unbidden one grey November afternoon, and stood just inside the door with her hands folded in the attitude of a woman rehearsing a confession she had not yet decided to make. "I owe you an explanation, Your Grace," she said. "I am not entirely certain I owe you an apology, since I am not entirely certain what I have done besides exist where I was placed. But I owe you the explanation." Clara set down her pen. "Sit down, then. I find explanations go better sitting." Mrs. Marsh sat, and after a silence that stretched longer than either woman found comfortable, said, "Mrs. Price arranges my income. He has done so since my husband died, and left me nothing but debts I could not pay. He suggested I come here as a companion. He suggested, more recently and more plainly, that I make myself agreeable to the Duke, on the understanding that my quarterly payments depended on it." She looked at her own hands. "I did not enjoy the dinner, Your Grace. I have not enjoyed a single evening in this house. I did as I was told, because the alternative was owing money to men considerably less courteous than your husband's cousin." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the woman across from her recalibrate what it meant to be believed rather than blamed. "What would you do," she asked, "if Mr. Price's income over you ceased to exist?" "I have not permitted myself to imagine it," Mrs. Marsh said. "Permit yourself now," said Clara. "I find imagining things is generally the first step toward making them true." It was that same week that Julian, without warning to anyone, unlocked the door of his father's old study for the first time since he was a boy of 11, a room that had stood shut for so long that the household had stopped remarking on it the way one stops remarking on a wall. He asked Clara to come in with him. Inside, under a film of undisturbed dust, were his father's letters, dozens of them, most never sent, some addressed to the son the old Duke had abandoned and never once posted, and a portrait of Julian's mother as a young woman, laughing, in a version of herself Julian said he could no longer remember having seen. "I have spent 20 years deciding that this room was proof feeling ruins a house, Julian said, standing amid the dust with his hands loose at his sides, in a way Clara had not seen since before their marriage. I wonder now whether it was only proof that a man who will not say what he feels ruins it just as thoroughly, and simply takes longer about it. That is closer to the truth, Clara said. I have not been fair to you. He said it plainly, without the varnish he usually gave to difficult sentences. I have not been anything to you these last 2 years. I let Price tell me things about your father's estate that I never troubled to verify, because verifying them would have required me to look at you directly, and I found that harder than I expected it to be. That is an explanation, Clara said. It is not yet an apology, and I find I require both, in their proper order, before I decide what any of this means going forward. She watched him absorb that without flinching, which she counted, privately, as a point in his favour. I will tell you what I require, when I have finished deciding it. In the meantime, I should like you to show me, not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time. He nodded, once, the way a man nods at a contract he has not yet read in full, but already intends to sign. That same evening, in front of Thomas and Mrs. Bragg, and the assembled household at supper, Julian took the muniment room's master ring of keys from the drawer where he had kept it since his father's death. The keys to every room in the house that mattered. The keys that had been, on paper if never in practice, his to hold. And placed them, without a speech, into Clara's hand. Thomas, watching, quietly unlooped the ribbon from beneath his collar, and set his own small key beside the ring, a boy returning something he had guarded well and no longer needed to guard alone. Mrs. Marsh's confession, once made to Clara, proved only the surface of what Mr. Edmund Price had been arranging beneath the floor of the Ashcombe estate for 2 years, and it took the combined and separately dramatised efforts of several people to bring the rest of it into the light. The first thread came from Sam Fenn, a stable boy of 13 who had been mucking out the tack room late one evening, and had seen, through the half-open door of Price's estate office, the man carefully re-inking a signature at the bottom of an old-looking document, comparing it against a second sheet held up to the candle. Sam had said nothing at the time, because saying things about the man who paid his wages struck him as a poor bargain for a stable boy with a widowed mother to support, but he mentioned it, eventually, to Mrs. Bragg over a plate of Sunday cold meat, and Mrs. Bragg brought him, gently, to Clara. "Tell her Grace what you saw, Mrs." Bragg said. "Same as you told me." Plain, Sam turned his cap over twice in his hands before he spoke. He were copying a hand, Your Grace, not his own. Practising it, like on scraps, before he put it proper on the real paper. I didn't think much of it at the time. Gentlemen do all sorts. Would you know the paper again if you saw it? I'd know the ink, Sam said. Blacker than the estate's usual. He keeps a separate bottle for it. In the bottom drawer, locked. Clara took this, along with her own months of small discrepancies, to Mr. Aldous Gray, the solicitor in the county town who had handled her father's affairs and, before that, her father's father's, a precise and entirely incorruptible man, who disliked imprecision the way some men dislike bad wine. Mr. Gray examined the note that Price had, some 18 months earlier, presented to Julian as evidence of a debt owed by the Whitmore estate to Ashcombe. A debt Clara's father had, according to the note, incurred shortly before his death and never repaid, and compared it item by item against the genuine settlement papers from Clara's own marriage, which had lain undisturbed in the muniment room the entire time, proving conclusively that no such debt existed, had ever existed, or could have existed under the terms her father had actually signed. The hand is good, Mr. Grey said, holding both documents to the window. Very good. But your father, your Grace, always crossed his sevens in the continental fashion, a habit from his years reading law abroad, and whoever forged this note did not know that, and wrote his sevens the plain English way. It is a small thing. It is, I think, sufficient. It was Tom Feathers who supplied the final piece, once word reached him, as word reaches tenants before it reaches anyone official, that the Duchess was quietly gathering evidence against the man who managed the estate's accounts. He came to Ashcombe Court of his own accord, without being asked, and laid before Clara a small tin box of receipts he had kept. Out of a farmer's native distrust of paper, he could not double-check. Every time he had paid his rent for the past 3 years. The sums did not match, in 4 separate quarters, the sums that Price's own ledger recorded as received. The difference, added up, came to just short of £90. Price, sensing correctly that the ground beneath him had begun to shift, though not yet understanding how far the crack had spread, moved to secure his position before it could be taken from him entirely. He went to Julian directly, alone, and presented the forged note again, this time with a demand rather than a suggestion that Ashfield, Clara's father's small estate, be transferred to Ashcombe in settlement of the debt before, he said delicately, matters became embarrassing for everyone concerned. He implied, without quite saying it, that Clara's growing popularity in the county made this an urgent matter of appearances, rather than a leisurely one of law. Best done quietly, Price said, before anyone thinks to ask questions that would only distress her further. Julian, who a season earlier might have signed whatever paper Price placed before him, did not sign it. He asked instead, in the flat voice he used for matters he had decided to take seriously, to see the original note again, side by side with the settlement papers Clara had shown him from the muniment room, and when Price hesitated, only for a moment, but a moment Julian noted the way Clara had taught him, without meaning to note such things, he said only, "I will need a few days to consider it," and sent word to Mr. Grey himself for the first time in his life. Clara received all of this with the composure that had by now become, in the county's whispered account of her, something close to legend, though it cost her more than anyone but Mrs. Bragg ever saw. "He means to take Ashfield," she said, the evening the demand reached her, sitting very straight in her chair with her hands folded in her lap. "My father built that house with his own money, and left it to me because he trusted me to keep it, and Mr. Price means to take it with a lie written in a hand that is not even his own." "Then we'd best make certain the lie doesn't survive to do it," Mrs. Bragg said, and refilled her tea, and Clara thought, not for the first time, that there were people in this world who offered comfort by weeping with you, and people who offered it by handing you a fresh cup and a plan, and that she had always, without quite admitting it, preferred the second kind. The county assembly held every autumn at Ashcombe Court to mark the close of the harvest had, for as long as anyone could remember, been a purely social occasion, dancing, cold suppers, the vicar's annual toast to the tenantry, Sir Walter Denny's annual complaint about the punch. That year, Clara arranged, with Mr. Grey's quiet assistance, for it to become something else as well, without announcing the change to anyone who did not need to know it in advance. The hall was full by 9, the neighbouring gentry, the tenant farmers who by long custom attended the latter half of the evening, Sir Walter Denny in his best coat, Mrs. Marsh seated, at her own quiet request, well away from the head of the table where she no longer wished to be placed. Julian stood near the fire, watching his wife move through the room with the particular stillness of a man who has finally understood what he is about to lose the right to take for granted, and Price stood near the door, smiling his warm smile at everyone who passed, entirely unaware that the room had already, in every way that mattered, turned against him. It began, as Clara had planned it should, with nothing more dramatic than Mr. Grey clearing his throat and asking, in the mild tone of a man discussing the weather, whether he might have a moment of the company's attention regarding a small matter of estate business that had, he said, grown rather too large to settle quietly. Julian, by prior arrangement, said that he thought it best settled here, before friends, rather than in a court where friends could not attend. Clara laid the documents on the long table herself, one at a time, in the order she had rehearsed with no one but her own conscience. The original settlement papers from her marriage, proving no debt had ever existed between the Whitmore and Ashcombe estates. The forged note laid beside them, with Mr. Grey pointing, without theatrics, to the plain English sevens that gave the whole thing away. Tom Feather's tin box of receipts, and Tom Feathers himself, cap in hand, confirming in his own plain words that he had paid what he had paid and been credited less. Sam Fenn, brought forward gently by Mrs. Bragg, describing the separate bottle of blacker ink kept locked in the bottom drawer of Price's desk. "I believe, miss," Grey said to Price, in the mildest voice imaginable, "that you keep that same ink for correspondence to your London bankers. Might I ask which drawer that correspondence is filed in?" It was a small question. It was, Clara thought, watching Price's face for the first time lose the smoothness it had worn for 2 years. Exactly the sort of small question her father had always said undid the largest lies, not the grand accusation, but the precise detail a guilty man has never troubled to prepare an answer for. Price said, after a pause a fraction too long, the bottom drawer, and then heard, in the small collective stillness of the room, exactly what he had just confirmed. "That is the drawer Sam describes," Clara said. "Locked," he says. "You have just told this room, unprompted, precisely which drawer holds the ink used to forge my father's signature. I did not ask you that question, Mr. Price. You asked it of yourself. The room's turning, when it came, was not loud. It moved through the assembled guests the way water moves through a lock gate once the mechanism gives, a low collective exhale, glances exchanged. Sir Walter Denny setting down his glass with a click that seemed, in the silence, very loud indeed. Mrs. Marsh, from her seat by the wall, said quietly but clearly enough to be heard, "He has paid my income for 2 years on the condition that I make myself agreeable in this house, your Grace, and I will swear it before anyone who requires me to," and something in Price's face, at that, went entirely out, the way a candle goes out not from a gust, but from simply running to the end of its wick. Julian crossed the room and stood beside his wife rather than at the head of the table where custom would have placed him, and said to the assembled county, in a voice that did not shake, though it plainly cost him something to keep it steady, "I told my son, at this table some months ago, that his mother would manage. I want it understood before all of you that she has managed considerably more than I ever gave her credit for managing, and that I was a fool, and worse than a fool, not to have seen it a great deal sooner." Clara could have destroyed Edmund Price that night. The evidence was sufficient to see him prosecuted, his name struck from every respectable list in 3 counties, his freedom forfeit for a good long while besides. She chose, instead, standing very straight with the muniment key once again at her waist, to say only, Price will resign his position tonight, repay what can be traced, and remove himself from this county within the month. I will not see him prosecuted, provided he goes quietly and does not return. I have found that mercy costs the giver more than the receiver ever knows, and I find I can afford the cost better than I can afford the alternative. She looked at him directly for the first time all evening. You very nearly took my father's house, with a lie in a hand that was not even yours. I would rather you spend what remains of your life knowing that I chose not to ruin you, than spend it believing you were merely unlucky. Price left the room without a word, which was, Clara thought, the first honest thing she had ever seen him do. The apology, when it finally came 3 days after the assembly, in the small parlour where Julian had begun taking his morning coffee, and it came in full, the way Clara had told him it must. I owe you the explanation you already have, Julian said, standing rather than sitting, as though the words required the discipline of remaining upright. My father taught me that feeling was a debt a man could not afford to carry, and I have spent 20 years paying that debt down by refusing to feel anything where you were concerned, and calling the refusal prudence. I let a man I should never have trusted tell me things about your family that I never once verified, because verifying them would have meant admitting I had been wrong to trust him instead of you. That is the explanation. It does not excuse anything. I am telling you because you asked for it, and because I find I no longer wish to be a man who explains himself instead of apologizing. He stopped, started again. I am sorry, Clara, not for the dinner alone, for every year before it that made the dinner possible. Clara set down her pen and looked at him for a long moment before she answered. That is the apology, she said. Now I will tell you my terms, since you have asked to hear them, and I expect them to be understood as terms, not as sentiment. She counted them on her fingers, the way she counted everything that mattered. The household and Ashfield remain under my authority in fact as well as in name, and that is to be recorded properly, with Mr. Grey as witness, so that no cousin or steward of yours may ever again suggest otherwise. My name is to appear on the estate's public accounts, not merely its private ones. The tenants are to be paid fairly and on time, and I will conduct the audit myself twice yearly, for as long as I choose to. And whatever passes between us from this day forward, I will not mediate the fate of the men who wronged this house. That is mine to decide, as it was decided 3 nights ago, and it will remain mine. All right, Julian said. All right, then, said Clara, and something in the flatness of the exchange, 2 words traded like a signature on a contract both parties had finally read in full, did more, she thought afterward, to settle the matter between them than any speech either of them might have made instead. The months that followed were not marked by declarations. They were marked, instead, by a series of small and specific things that Clara, out of old habit, recorded in the same private ledger where she had once recorded 11 shillings and a leaking granary roof. Julian moved his chair at breakfast, without remark, from the head of the table to the place beside hers. He learned, over the course of a single winter, the names of every tenant family on the estate, and used them correctly, which the tenants noticed and mentioned to each other with the particular pleasure of people long accustomed to being managed rather than known. He began pouring Clara's tea before she asked for it, which was nothing in isolation, and, by spring, had become the sort of thing the whole household quietly understood to mean everything. There was one relapse, in February, when a tenant's fence dispute came to him directly, and he settled it alone, in the old way, without consulting Clara at all, simply because the habit of deciding things unilaterally was 20 years deep and had not yet worn fully smooth. Clara said nothing accusatory when she learned of it. She only said, That evening, you decided that alone. You have not done that since November. In the same tone she might have used to note a discrepancy in a ledger, and Julian, to his credit, did not defend himself. "You are right," he said. "I will go back tomorrow and tell the tenant I should have consulted you first, and we will settle it properly. Together," he did. It cost him a measure of pride to admit an error to a tenant farmer, and Clara noted, watching him do it anyway, that the willingness to pay that particular cost was worth considerably more to her than any speech he might have made in its place. It was Thomas, oddly, who drew the declaration out of his father, asking him one evening at supper, with the blunt curiosity of a boy of 9, whether he loved mother now, since everyone in the county seemed to think he did. Julian was quiet long enough that Clara thought he might deflect the question the old way, with courtesy instead of truth. Instead, he said, looking at Clara rather than at his son, "I would choose your mother. Not merely today. I have been choosing her, I think, for some months now. Every morning I have poured her tea before she asked for it. Every evening I have sat beside her, instead of across from her. That is not the same thing as saying the 3 words everyone expects. I find I trust it rather more." "That will do," Clara said, and if her voice was not entirely steady when she said it, no one at the table remarked upon it, out of the same tact the household had learned to extend to a woman who had earned the right, at last, to a single unrationed feeling. 2 years brought a great many changes to Ashcombe Court, none of them loud, all of them lasting. Edmund Price had gone, as instructed, quietly north to a distant relation's small property, where he was said to manage accounts under close and unglamorous supervision, his name mentioned in the county now only as a cautionary example rather than a threat. Mrs. Sylvie Marsh, freed of her debt to a man who no longer had any hold over her, had opened a milliner's shop in the county town, with a small loan from Clara that she repaid, in full and ahead of schedule, within 18 months, and she wrote to Clara twice a year. Letters that had over time become genuinely fond rather than merely grateful. Sam Fenn had been apprenticed, at Julian's insistence and expense, to a respectable estate surveyor, on the theory that a boy who noticed the wrong ink in the wrong drawer had an eye worth training properly. Tom Feathers's rent receipts now matched, to the penny, the estate's own ledgers every quarter, and the fair wage schedule Clara had instituted for every tenant on the estate had been posted, framed, in the estate office, where it remained, unaltered, for anyone to read. Clara had, in that second year, opened a small school in the old dower cottage for the children of the estate's tenants, boys and girls both, taught 3 mornings a week by the vicar's unmarried sister, and funded, quietly, out of the household accounts Clara still audited twice a year with her own hand. Above the school's door she had a new key made, plain and unremarkable, and instead of wearing it at her waist the way she had worn the muniment key for so many years, she hung it on an open hook just inside the entrance, where any child, any tenant, any passing soul might take it down and let themselves in. "You might have kept that one," Julian said, watching her hang it there on the day the school opened, Thomas, 11 now, and tall for his age, standing beside them both. "I kept the other one long enough," Clara said. "This one is meant to be found, not guarded. The house itself, visitors sometimes remarked, without quite knowing why they remarked it, no longer felt the way it once had, held, waiting, the way a breath is held before bad news. It felt, instead, like a house that had exhaled, all at once, some years before, and had simply gone on breathing ever since. Clara Vane, Duchess of Ashcombe, had once been a woman whose worth was measured entirely by what she was useful for, and never once by what she was loved for, and she had spent 2 years discovering that the two things, once properly earned, need not be separate accounts at all. She had not asked to be seen. She had made herself, through patient and unglamorous work, impossible to unsee, and the county that had once pitied her for her invisible competence now measured every other household in the shire against the standard she had quietly, methodically, set. Her father had told her, long before any of it, that memory is a coward, but paper is not. And she had built her whole reckoning on the truth of that sentence, but she understood, by the end, that he had left out the rest of it, the part he had perhaps not lived long enough to learn himself. That paper could prove what had happened, but only a person, freely choosing, day after ordinary day, could prove what would happen next. Not because a debt was owed, because a life, once truly seen, was worth choosing on its own account, every morning, without needing to be asked twice.